is 1984, the book by George Orwell. BBC, anti-government propaganda. BBC is British Broadcasting Corporation. It's part of the British government. So, is it government, anti-government propaganda? George Orwell's book, 1984, which was made into a... I didn't know that until today. I didn't know the following. But I found out that it was made into a BBC TV program in 1954, which was 5 years after it was published. And George Orwell was a propagandist for the British government during World War II. And so, those are a couple details that I'll touch on. I titled this piece is 1984 Government, Anti-Government Propaganda, BBC, Public Television, Anti-Government Propaganda, because that's what I am exploring as a possibility. So, on to the text. Some groups of people may establish systems of organized coercion, also known as governments. The rest of us may call those people the rulers, the leaders, the elite, the patriarchs, or the founding fathers. Then, those groups who establish violent governing systems with courts, regulations, and of course armed law enforcement mercenaries may publicize their systems. They may create propaganda systems to further influence the attention, perception, and behavior of the target populations, including even to produce anti-government sentiment. I'll make a quick note here. The court systems and armed law enforcement mercenaries and regulations are all to influence the behavior of the target populations, and so are the propaganda systems, including things like BBC. So there are two basic kinds of propaganda, of course. First, propaganda to promote compliance, as in the perception of legitimacy of a particular system of organized coercion. And two, a propaganda to entice the disloyal to identify themselves to the government and take some action to justify the re-education, correction, punishment, or even the execution of those cultivated rebels. The cultivating of rebels in order to identify them was the theme of George Orwell's famous book 1984, in which Winston Smith volunteers to participate in an anti-government conspiracy, which happens to be a false front operation of the ruling government. Oddly, many people seem to miss that point, that theme of the book, and instead interpret the book as merely a criticism of tyranny. To present the basic behavioral patterns of tyranny is not to criticize tyranny, but simply to direct attention to it. Ideally, the flow of anti-government sentiment cultivated by propaganda is typically kept moderate, as in a steady trickle. However, there are times when a clash between governments may be produced, like the invasion or liberation of one government by another, or overthrow. Prior to that, there may be a larger polarization created, as in first divide and then conquer next, to create a polarization amongst the public, in which the morale of a population is reduced by anti-government sentiment being cultivated more than usual. Civilian anti-government protesters may even be enticed to confront riot squads and tanks. Typically, such confrontations go rather poorly for the civilian anti-government protesters. More protests may be used to justify more draconian measures. More draconian measures may be used to justify and stir up more protests, and so on it goes. If indigenous populations rebel, governments may increase the frequency of bombing. If slaves rebel, governments may tighten policing and encourage lynching, perhaps protecting, through the politically directed discretion of local government criminal prosecutors, protecting those in league with the government who commit atrocities. And they may say, oh, it's an anti-government rebel who did it. Well, it may be an anti-government rebel funded, trained, and directed by the government and protected by the criminal prosecutors of the law enforcement system. There will be additional audio segments made. This is the end of the first one. Look on the blog, scroll down below to find the next right-facing triangle play button on the next video.